I'm Chris Newton, creator of Feed, the Vampire Mythos RPG. In 10-Minute Mythos, I prove the endless possibilities of vampire role-playing by taking one random inspiration and using it to sketch out an original vampire mythos, all in 10 minutes. No prep, no script, just one gamer who loves a good vampire story. Wish me luck. Welcome to what I hope will be a very literary episode of 10-Minute Mythos. I've done some kind of crazy stories in the last few episodes, so I decided to try to find random generators that will give me something a little more serious to work with. I have chosen one. It is the plot scenario generator at archetypewriting.com. And so now I'm going to generate something and hopefully come up with a super serious story. The story starts when your protagonist opens the closet to find clothes that aren't his or hers. Another character is a bus driver who doesn't like animals. Okay, well, I have no idea what to do with this bus driver, so let's start with the easy part, which is a very intriguing premise. The story starts when your protagonist opens the closet to find clothes that aren't his or hers. So this makes me think of sort of Kafka-esque alienation, a mystery of what your life is and who you are and weird goings-on. I want to keep this more grounded, so it makes me think of maybe the idea of vampires not quite being the people they were in life. I think some loss of memory actually would be an interesting thing to throw in here, because you've got immortality, a change of body, a change of perspective, and I think if you mixed that with an alteration to people's memories, you could sort of go for a vibe like Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, where you have a character who sort of remembers a life, but maybe they're not really that person. A sense of dissociation, of being the same person socially and yet having been replaced by someone else, not being the person you remember. So maybe we could do that. Maybe we could have a story where it would be very personal, and it would be someone who comes back from the dead with the profound existential knowledge that they are not really the person who lived before in this body. Even though they remember all the same things, everything is different. They feel like a different person. Their whole emotional character is different. They feel differently about the people in their lives. Like, I remember I was married to you, but I don't love you. I love him. I think something like that could be, and trying to work that into a social network, trying to deal with all the interactions that would be displaced by that could be really cool. So the element of coming back from the dead and maybe being possessed by something supernatural, that's a definite vampire trope that could play into that theme. Another one that could do that, I think, is the predatory aspect and the need for blood. You could use this as perhaps a medication almost. In fact, what you could do is create characters who have a sort of void. One of the things I liked about the some of the early George Romero zombies was the idea that they're in all this pain and they need the brain to medicate it. So you could do the same kind of thing in a vampire story, and you could have it so that the blood is not about anything like some kind of supernatural nutrition or something like that, but it's rather that vampires are totally dissociated. They have no sense of identity. They don't feel like anyone. They come back empty. But by drinking blood, they can have subjective experience. When they drink your blood, they feel like you. And this also takes the edge off the predatory aspect, which could create monstrous characters who are very misunderstood and who also misunderstand the people around them. From the outside, this is an attack by a monster. From the perspective of the vampire, this is an attempt to be that person, like an attraction to that person that is not about wanting to possess them exactly, but about wanting to be them, about wanting to live their life, which is what you get with the blood. And if you don't drink blood, then you don't get to live a life. You get to have a body, but it's not you. You don't feel connected to the flesh. This would be a really kind of existential game. It would be really difficult with certain groups, I think with many groups, but with a very small group of like maybe 2 or 3 players and a GM, who create really interesting human characters. For maybe they would need to have lives that are already interesting in their own right and have lots of cool NPCs. Again, you'd want to look at the impact this has on marriages, on parents and their children, on people's lives and their jobs or whatever. I can imagine a character who has like a professional job and using vampirism as an aspect, almost a metaphor for the sort of, I don't want to say a midlife crisis, but that moment of dissociation when you look in the mirror and catch yourself playing the role that's prescribed to you by the life you've chosen materially, your job, your clothes, and you look at it and you feel like you have turned yourself into somebody you aren't. Really turning that into the tragedy of a character who has this experience that is death, and then they sit back up, but it's like the continuity of life is broken. They are no longer that person, but they have to continue pretending to be. And the only way for them to have now any kind of fulfillment, any kind of real life, is to take it from others, to choose the person they want to be, and they have to take the blood as a way to temporarily feel life. And that puts them in a zero-sum relationship with these people who perhaps they admire. Naturally, they're going to prey on the people whose lives they want. Let's see. So we've got another aspect here which doesn't seem to fit this at all. Another character is a bus driver who doesn't like animals. The animal thing actually stands out to me because, of course, there's all kinds of animals in vampire stories. So maybe actually you could turn around the old idea of animals not liking vampires, and you could have vampires who have an issue with animals. It would actually be kind of not in a funny way, but in sort of a metaphorical way. You could oppose the two. Again, I'm kind of turning to existentialism here. Like, the animal is totally in itself and in its moment, and maybe vampires don't. This is why they can't feed on animals, because you get the subjective experience, you get the life of the blood you feed on, and when you feed on an animal, you get what is for a human or a humanoid creature a profoundly disturbing experience of being without identity, just existing in the world, like sort of like perfectly living in the moment, but without sort of the buffer of enlightenment to make that comforting. Instead, it's just like suddenly kind of being your flesh and just being a creature, just being in the world, which is terrifying. You could say that like many new vampires try to feed on animals and have like a bad trip, like a horrifying experience of just being flesh and blood walking around on a planet and never want to experience that again. And that causes them to need human blood even more, because it's like they know that's the truth of what we are, what we all are, but vampires feel it unless they medicate. So yeah, and then the idea, this also takes me to something like Perfect Blue, the idea of wanting someone else's identity. You could make that a big part of the story. Every character is not only who they are, but also who they want to be, who they would like to feel, what they would like to feel, who they want to identify with, and how identifying with someone is a relationship with them. The closer you get, the more friction there is. So you could have people who want to feed on their old family members. You could have people who want to feed on some stranger that they used to idolize. And you could have people who just feed on anybody and develop this connection to humanity, a connection to, imagine if you're just feeding on people who are on the margins of society, which is a common tactic for vampires. You now have this very broad experience. Every night you feel like somebody else and get this little glimpse of what it is to be them, which could eventually develop into a kind of enlightenment and a very strange view of the world, understanding what it's like to be everybody, and how that all fits together. And yet this alienation, and how those characters would relate to each other. I feel like this would be a campaign where maybe the characters inhabit the same city, but they don't cross paths very often. And you'd want an overarching plot that maybe is about how vampirism came about in this town and then how it's ultimately resolved, but the plot would be very hands-off. It would just be a few key events, and most of the story would be about how, say, three very different people deal with drifting away from their lives and coming to contemplate being something different and trying to find identity in a condition that's denying it to them. So it's a pretty high concept game, and a little bit on the philosophical side, I feel. But I at least would enjoy playing it, and I can definitely imagine getting a certain group of people to really put everything into creating full-blown like novelistic characters and just exploring them in this setting. Probably in a modern, like, small city would be best, so that you get a broad cross-section of people. There's something very urban about this to me. The whole feeling of alienation and the way that's been talked about in literature is associated with cities, but maybe not a huge city, so that these characters can have a little more indirect interaction and more plausibly kind of bounce into each other's lives a little bit. So yeah, that's pretty much the idea. And I see I've got, I think, less than a minute left here. Um, so yeah, in terms of the strain, it would just be, I see these as pretty much classic vampires, except that they can go out in the sun. Um, they need to be able to live basically normal lives. And I think the body horror, you definitely have it, but as an aside. Like the changes in the body would be just a very convenient shorthand for showing um, how strange these lives have become. So that sound is my alarm going off. So yeah, there it is. Somewhat of a weird, downbeat, existential entry, but it's kind of what I wanted. So.